Hello from Nashville. I'm George Grimm at Grimm Guitars. Ready for our question and answer session today, June 25th, 2021. We have a number of questions from our listeners, but we can certainly use more. So if you have any, please send them in, because we will get to them today on any that you submit during the course of this presentation. I'd like to start by showing a number of Martin guitars that illustrate quite well the evolution of not only Martin, but of the modern style guitar. So, one moment, and I will reach over and grab one. To start with, we'll show a Martin guitar from 1836, made in the style of Martin's early mentor, Johann Georg Stauffer. Martin worked at the Stauffer workshop for about a decade before going on his own. Stauffer was in Vienna, and this is a guitar that is a very typical German design, but Stauffer was quite innovative in his own way. This has a bolt-on neck, the fingerboard is raised off the body, fastens with a clock key mechanism and complex tuner mechanism in that peg head under that nice engraved plate. Martin imported these tuners from Germany. They were expensive. The German design bridge with bridge pins rather than tie-on, and there's actually very little on this guitar that we can say is truly a unique C.F. Martin design. This is a Martin made in the Stauffer style, with a Stauffer style body shape, body size, relatively shallow body. On this instrument, everything that's white is genuine ivory. So the bindings on the top and back edge of the body and on the fingerboard are genuine ivory. And this is historically a very significant guitar. And it does have a grafted on peg head, which is barely visible, but there is a V graft, which you can just barely see on this. There's no carved volute, but there is a graft of a V shape here, such that this piece and the peg head are different. Also, the heel is grafted on, so the neck is three pieces. The heel, the ice cream cone shaped heel, and the middle section of the neck and the peg head are separate pieces. That style was made by Martin from the beginning in 1833 when he arrived in the USA. Until the late 1830s, when John Cooper and Bruno in New York, some of the music teachers that were buying guitars from Martin to sell to their students and others, were increasingly demanding Spanish design guitars, and Martin adapted to that. So next step is, here's an 1842 Martin, and this still has a more Spanish design bridge that you can tie on or have knots on the end, but no bridge pins. They did this only very briefly. They went right back soon to the more German style with bridge pins, but also on this guitar, everything that's ivory is, anything that's white on this guitar is genuine ivory. So bindings and the bridge are all, the tuning pegs are ivory, and the friction pegs were easy for quick string change for professionals. They often preferred this over the geared pegs. You could change strings quicker if a string broke, and gut strings were prone to breaking. And the gut strings, unlike nylon, didn't keep stretching and stretching and stretching. So if you changed the string, you could tune it up real quick. And if you were skilled at it, you could tune very, very quickly and change the string very quickly with the friction pegs. The purfling on the side is not only decorative, but this is a two-piece matched, book-matched side, just like the back is book-matched two-piece. The sides are also book-matched two pieces. So this is Brazilian rosewood, spruce top, and a lot of this spruce was probably Adirondack spruce. But this is the next step. And this particular guitar has a 5-strut fan. This is prior to the first X-braced Martin. The first X-braced Martin was done for Madame de Gonay in 1843, but this guitar I just showed is 1842. And also is a very early guitar made in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. Although the guitars were stamped C.F. Martin, New York from 1833 through 1867, or through 1866, and during 67 switched to C.F. Martin and Company, New York. In each case, New York was not necessarily where it was made. They were made in New York from 1833 through early 1839, after which Martin and family moved from New York to Nazareth, Pennsylvania, but they continued to use a New York distributor through 1897. And 1897 was a period of economic, real depression, hardship. And the dealer that they had in New York, Zobish, had written to Martin that they wanted Martin to hold off shipping any more for the rest of the year, that they just already had enough Martins and really couldn't sell more. Let's just wait a year before we resume. Martin decided, this was Frank Henry Martin, said that we're not going to do that. We'll just go independent and start marketing them ourselves. And so from 1898 onward, they were stamped with the C.F. Martin name, but Nazareth, PA. Also, at that same time in 1898, they began putting serial numbers stamped on the guitar on the neck block. Martins did actually have serial number records before that, but they didn't put the serial number anywhere on the guitar. So record keeping on that, while it was quite good, makes it very problematic sometimes for dating them now. But there are a number of people, specifically Greg Hutton in Canada has a very sophisticated computer base that he's worked on for many years of Martin files and information. And you can get a great deal of information also just calling C.F. Martin and talk to their customer service department. But that 1842 guitar is one that still looks relatively modern as far as the body shape, but that body shape, peg head shape, the volute on the back of the peg head, every bit of this is actually Martin's copy of Spanish designs from makers in Cadiz, Spain, such as Reyes and Pages. This has a 5-strut fan, as I mentioned before, which is virtually identical to a Torres design fan, except that Torres, Antonio de Torres, the so-called founder of the modern classical style guitar, didn't work until the 1850s. So that's a guitar that precedes Torres by as much as 10 years, but it still is a design that is the pre-Torres design. Torres modernized the classical with a different shaped neck, different body dimensions, and so it's not simply the fan pattern, but fan patterns have been around for some time. I have another guitar. One of the earliest makers, other than Martin in the USA. This is Schmidt and Mall in New York from the 1850s. And both of them worked for Martin. In fact, Louis Schmidt was Martin's first employee, came over on the boat with the Martin family in 1833 from Germany. But when Martin moved to Pennsylvania, Schmidt and Mall went independent and stayed in New York and Staten Island. But this still has the peghead shape, body shape, very much like Martin. And this has the X bracing inside, which is virtually identical to the X pattern in the 1843 guitar, the first X braced guitar Martin made for Madame de Guy. And this is an interesting guitar, very, very much like a Martin, but this has wood bindings on the edge of the body, which you typically don't see on a Martin. The back stripe is wider than you typically see on a Martin, but the construction is still remarkably similar to Martin. And it's a very good guitar. All of these are guitars designed for gut rather than steel. Next one I'd like to show is the 1857 single O size style 27 ornamentation with multicolored wood trim around the edges. Nice fancy wood marquetry on the back, Brazilian rosewood, Adirondack spruce, Spanish cedar neck, which is what Martin was using right up through 1917, after which they went to mahogany. Also, this is a grafted peg head, as Martin was doing up through 1917. So the graft goes right along here and then follows the volute, different from the Spanish design graft, but still Spaniards in Cadiz used on many of the pages, Reyes and others did this peg head shape. They did this type volute, but it didn't incorporate a graft. The graft on the Spanish peg head was, they did graft it, but it was not following that volute line the way the Martin does. Martin has a very sophisticated workmanship. This guitar is X braced, but still was designed for gut strings. So the fact that a guitar has bridge pins and has X bracing does not mean that it was designed for steel. There are folks who have written that, you know, Martin was the first to do steel string guitars, and as evidenced by the fact that they were the first to do X bracing. Well, X bracing was not done to accommodate steel strings. The X bracing on these early ones is very light and was designed for gut strings, and the people who bought these guitars typically were classical players. Next one I'd like to show, here's a 1922 single 045, and what you can see is that the basic design of this guitar is virtually identical to the basic design of that 1857 guitar. Same peg head shape, same neck dimensions, same body size, same body shape, same bridge design. The ornamentation on 45 has abalone trim around the top and the sides and the back, but the basic structural features that go into the design of the guitar on this one are basically the same as on this 1857 guitar. Same peghead shape, same body size, body shape, bracing pattern, neck shape. There's almost no real evolutionary change in the Martin guitar in that period of time from the 1850s through the mid 1920s. However, we can say that Martin's great periods of innovation therefore get down to the late 1830s through the early 1850s were a period of great innovation and change for Martin. They started out basically making a Stauffer copy, and the Stauffer copy was made so precisely like the Stauffer that for all practical purposes, I can't call it innovative. I can just say that it was very well made. Is it better than a Stauffer? No, it's essentially just like a Stauffer. The design, the workmanship, whatever, it's essentially the same as the Stauffer, which is very good for its day, but it was a parlor guitar that did not have great power of projection. It had good tone. It would record well in a studio, but they didn't have studios back then to record, and they didn't have microphones or PA systems, so that the Stauffer design guitar was not well suited to a concert hall or even to playing in a group with violin or bass or piano. You just wouldn't hear it very well over that. It was good for intimate parlor settings and really not a concertizing guitar. The Spanish design, even as early as that 1842 guitar, has much more projection, not as much projection as a modern classical guitar, but still pretty good volume. And by the time you get even to the 1922 Martin, strung with gut or nylon, it sounds good. You can play classical on it very effectively, although it's not the neck dimension or the scale that most classical players are used to today. It's about a 24.9-inch scale, whereas classical players today want a 650 millimeter scale, which is just right on very close, a little over 25.5 inches. And the classical guitars today have a wider neck of at least 2 inches to as much as 2 1/8 inches wide at the nut, whereas the older Martin is more like 1 7/8, and the Martin neck is more V-shaped. You wrap your thumb around it. But it was still designed for classical players. It's just that the classical guitar evolved. And after Segovia came and toured the USA in the 1920s, the demand for Martin's type guitars dropped like a stone. And Martin needed to come up with something. So they started bracing guitars for steel. They made the tops a little thicker. They beefed up the bracing a bit. And they were suitable for Hawaiian style music or for regular so-called Spanish neck, which is basically at that point a standard style guitar neck was called a Spanish style, and the other would be for Hawaiian, played with a bar. But what Martin did early on in steel string guitars was basically just beef up the design. And every model, single O, double O, triple O, ND, had a 12 fret predecessor. For example, this is one of our new 12 fret model D customs, but this is essentially what a D28 would have looked like in 1931 through 1933. It would be this body shape, the extended length, dreadnought, and the 14 fretters have a body 2 frets shorter. If you just lop this body off 2 frets, you have the shape of a modern dreadnought guitar. But the D28 did not have a 14 fret neck, until 1934. But this guitar here is modern, built to our specs, Adirondack spruce, non-torrefied, very good sounding guitar. But this is essentially the next step in the evolution of Martin. You can also see the same basic thing in, for example, quadruple 12 fret, extended length body, slotted peg head. And this is very, very similar in shape to the guitar of the 1850s or the guitar of the 1920s. It wasn't until late 29 that Martin came out with their OM model. OM stands for orchestra model. But what they did is they took a 12 fret triple O, which is essentially this body shape, and lopped it off 2 frets shorter, giving it a more squared off shape, and used it's a solid peg head, same peg head shape as this, but call the 1842 guitar, that's essentially modern Martin shape. It's the same shape as the slot head, but it's solid because it was originally for this model with friction pegs. But if you take that basic peg head shape and put geared tuners on it, then you have the modern Martin style peg head. And the first model they did that with was the OM. Here is a modern custom shop OM that we have made to our specs. This is with Adirondack spruce, sinker mahogany for the neck block, end block, interior linings, back and sides. It has the small OM style pick guard. The bigger pick guard came out in 31, the more modern Martin guard. This belly bridge came out in 30. So this guitar here is a new guitar built like an OM 18. And these are very good, but this does show the basic evolution from 12 fret to 14 fret. And so essentially, once that happened, you had a modern steel string guitar. Martin has come up with some changes over the years. For example, the original Martins all had bar frets, where the fret going into the fingerboard was the same thickness as above the board. Modern frets, if you look at them from the side, you can see, well, actually this has binding on it, so you can't see it, but I'll have to find a different one to show. But the bar frets, right, simply going into the board are the same thickness as above the board, and it permitted compression fretting, so it stiffened the neck without a truss rod of any kind, no metal reinforcement in the neck, but the frets themselves were slightly thicker than the slots, and it gave stiffness to the neck as a direct result. And they could adjust that, the thickness of frets. But modern style frets, let's find one. Here we have, this is a 1944 Martin, but it's still the same modern type fret. You can see the tang going into the board is much thinner than above the board. And this is what started in late 1934. So when they did that simultaneously with the modern frets, they put a steel T-bar in the neck to stiffen the neck, and they no longer did compression fretting. So that also gets you to the modern body shape. The squared off upper bout is the modern style, and on the 12 fretter, that body goes all the way up to here. And you have a more rounded shoulder, like the one I showed you from 1931 through 33 style dreadnought. So that basically covers a lot of the evolution of the Martin to get it up to what they are now. So essentially, their body shapes for 14 fret guitars were already very well organized in the early 1930s, with the OM starting in late 29, and then most of the other models between 32 through 34. For example, on the single O and double O size guitars, the mahogany ones went to 14 fret models in 1932, but the rosewood single O and double O guitars stayed 12 fret right on through World War II for the single O and double O size in rosewood, but triple O rosewood guitars were 14 fret as of 1934, as were the Ds. Martin still to this day makes some models with 12 fret slot head necks, and there are folks, me included, who really like that style. So some of the custom guitars that we offer have those specs. Martin certainly has evolved over the years in their manufacturing techniques. They are using quite a bit more of computer numeric control CNC equipment now, but they still have plenty of hand work. There's many operations such as binding a guitar that to this day, no machine does it, even in Asian factories that are mass producing student model guitars. If they have binding on the body, that's done by hand. And that does add cost. But Martin certainly has evolved over the years in their tooling and in the size and organization of the factory. Martin was in a building through the mid-1960s. The North Street factory in Nazareth was not much bigger than the building I'm in right now for my shop. And right now I've got 3 floors and about 18,000 square feet. And the Martin building on North Street was only slightly bigger than what I have now. But it's amazing how many great guitars were made at that facility. For all practical purposes, every steel string guitar they made during the so-called golden era was made in that building. And but today, the quality of new Martin guitars, in my opinion, is some of the best they've had in well over a half century. Martin's guitars made right now stack up remarkably well to the vintage originals. They don't beat the ones of golden era. Like most players I know would still say the golden era is still unsurpassed. But the fact is, and unsurpassed and unequaled, but they come remarkably close. Close enough that I feel that for my own playing, I like the new ones better than I like almost anything they've made since before World War II. You'd have to go back to the 1930s before they were really making guitars that I feel are truly superior to what is available from Martin right now. It's quite remarkable, and Martin is not alone in having that excellent quality now. The new Gibsons and Fenders are better than what they made 50 years ago. And new Taylors are not competing with vintage Taylors so much. They're actually better. I think the best Taylors are the ones they make right now. But Taylor only started in 1974, so they don't have as long a tradition as Martin, Gibson, or Fender. But in the grand scheme of things, Taylor's still been around long enough to prove themselves for sure, without a shadow of a doubt. And they are making fine guitars in the US and in Mexico. The guitars Taylor makes, bang for buck, are very good. And they're making as many guitars per year as Martin, if not more. So it's in the multi-hundreds a day in both Mexico and the USA. Taylor is doing very well on that. And Martin also has a Mexican factory. The Taylor factory in Tecate, Mexico is not much over half an hour away from the US factory as far as getting there by car, although you do have to spend a little time at the border crossing. The Mexican factory for Martin is in Navajoa, which is about 350 miles south of the border. And the border is a goodly way from Nazareth, PA, so they don't just hop over there for lunch. But the fact is, both companies are producing in Mexico and in the US. And both companies very clearly differentiate the Mexican from the US product. The Mexican ones are good, but they are clearly labeled as such. And the US products are still the premier line. But the quality of guitars from the Mexican factories is remarkably good. And bang for buck, they are fine guitars. But the quality of student model guitars today is better than it was when I started out in the 60s. Quality student models back then is such that the Harmony and K guitars in the music stores were almost unplayable. The neck rods didn't work, the neck set angles were bad, and they were embarrassingly poor instruments. But today, student models are quite good. Okay, now some questions that have come in. David Cuther asks, without a serial number, how do you date that guitar to 1842 specifically? Answer to your question is Martin records are incredibly good. And Greg Hutton in Canada has a website, plus I can call him up, and based on the specs of the instrument and the bracing pattern, he can pretty well narrow it down to that year. Also the same question for the 1857 guitar. Well, the 1857 guitar one, he can tell you exactly how many of that model were made during a time period. He can tell you that the pattern of the cloth lining inside the case ended in 58, but the type tuners on it were not made after 57. And he was able to narrow that down to 1 year. And he was also able to narrow down the 1842 guitar. Martin's record keeping was really quite remarkable even then. And a lot of that record not only was remarkable then, but there's been a remarkable job preserving them. And Hutton spent years working on organizing them and cross-indexing these records. So yes, it's not pure guesswork. There's a goodly bit of information that can get it down to pretty narrow. And in some particular instances, some years ago, I had a very deluxe New York labeled Stamp Martin that he was able to narrow down not only to the year, but to the customer's name, and found the correspondence back and forth from Martin and the customer on that particular instrument. So we can't narrow every one of them down that well, but in most cases, we can still narrow it down pretty darn close. The same person asks, do the tuning pegs have an issue keeping in tune? Not any more than on a modern flamenco with friction pegs, and not any more than a violin with friction pegs. And classical players to this day are using friction pegs on their violins. Now, they do have a fine tuner on the high E, classical players do, with one metal string. But on the rest of the strings, they're just using the friction pegs. Most country fiddlers and bluegrass fiddlers are using fine tuners on all four strings on a fiddle, but classical players typically are not, except for the high E. Is there a big issue tuning that guitar? If you're used to those type pegs, and if they're properly adjusted, then they are actually not especially difficult to tune with. Is it as easy for most people as using geared pegs? No. But if you're used to it, they're not a great problem. And the players of that day, skilled pros, typically preferred the friction pegs because they could tune very quickly, especially if they broke a string, they could change strings quickly, and they would never have any risk of the tuner rattling. So the friction pegs have a precise fit, and you'll never have any rattling gears that are distracting. Karen Rawls says the shaded top Martin seems to be very popular now. I don't remember seeing many older Martins with a shaded top. Do you find this to be true? The one-word answer to the question is yes. The more detailed answer is that Martin did offer shaded tops even as far back as pre-1900, but typically the shaded tops then were a uniform dark, often chocolate brown, that was available as an option. Starting in the early 30s, rather than just a uniform dark, you could get a sunburst. And it varied depending on the year. The 1935 pattern sunburst is the pattern sunburst on some that I like, the D that I held up earlier today. This one. This is the 1935 pattern sunburst, very dark on the edges, lighter in the middle. By the late 30s, on into the 40s and 50s, and even into the 60s, you could get sunbursts. They typically were nowhere near that dark, and but they still were sunbursts. They were available, but it wasn't so popular with Martin back then. Gibsons were done sunburst very routinely in the period from the 1920s. On the mandolins, and there were sunburst finishes even very, very early in the history of the company. So going back to as early as around 1905, there were some instruments with sunburst from Gibson, but Martin didn't do very many sunbursts at all till the 1930s, but shaded tops were done earlier, but it was still a small minority of the instruments they did. It's been trendy in the recent couple of decades that sunburst finish Martins, old ones, bring more money. But part of that was simply a matter of rarity. But people got to looking at those things and seeing that they're rare, and more they want a new one to just order one that looks like that. So we're finding right now that pretty significant portion of the customers actually do like sunburst finishes. And on our quadruple O size Martins that we're having custom made, we're ordering the same number of sunbursts as we are natural. That's not the ratio in which they would have been done in 1935, but it's the ratio that customers seem to like now. Although in dreadnought guitars, we still find that it's probably only somewhere between a quarter and 1/3 of the customers seem to really prefer a burst on a dreadnought. It's not quite as traditional for bluegrassers, but more and more, even those guys are getting into sunburst finishes. So it's a matter of personal preference and market demographic trends, but the fact is the ratios of the 1930s were such that far fewer bursts were done then than now. But now a high percentage of the customers do indeed like the sunburst finish. Smurl Rockhard says, can you please discuss the vintage 1967 Fender Coronado 2 Cherry and values? I'm not providing appraisal services as part of the question and answer, but I will at least say the Fender Coronado was probably inspired by the Gibson ES335. The body shape is too much to be coincidence, but the Coronado models are fully hollow, whereas the 335 has a semi-hollow body with a block down the middle. And the Fenders have single coil pickups, and they have the standard Fender shaped peg head, and it's a bolt-on neck. Quite a different beast from the Gibson. Also, the body, well, it's laminated, as is a Gibson. On the double cutaways, the Fender bodies are thinner and lighter weight, and most people don't feel that they put out the sound that the Gibson double cutaway guitars bring. I don't find near as much demand for them as for the Gibson ES335 or 345 or 355. Most of the customers I have would strongly prefer the Gibson over that Fender. They offered Coronados in a number of colors. Cherry red is one of the options. The most common is Sunburst. But they also made some that they call wildwood, that they injected dye into the tree's roots, and the color went into the tree and gave sort of a multi-color streaked pattern that as it was distributed through the tree, they'd harvested that dye would be there in the wood because it had grown that way with the dye in it. But I don't get very many requests for Coronados. They are mildly collectible, but I've yet to find anybody who says that they sound as good or better than the Gibson. They don't bring as much money as a 335 Gibson of the same age, but they are, at least historically, an interesting footnote. Nick asks, some manufacturers produce a specific baritone acoustic guitar. Are they different from the standard guitar other than the strings? And the answer is yes, they're different, but it depends on the manufacturer. Also, the tuning on a baritone can be, on what people are calling a baritone, can be 3 frets lower than a standard guitar, which is what Santa Cruz is offering, with a extended length body dreadnought similar to a standard tuned D extended length dreadnought that I did, like the one I showed. Taylor offers one also tuned in that range in 6-string or in 8-string. on their 8-string, the 2 middle strings, the D and what would be the D and the G, actually tuned 3 frets down, but they're strung in octaves like a 12-string guitar. And it's a rather interesting sound. I happen to like that Taylor design with the double stringing on the 2 middle strings in octaves. It just brightens it up, and the whole guitar seems to respond quite well. But there are a number of makers that have done baritones. Typically, they have a larger body than most 6-string guitars, but some makers of baritones have them designed to be tuned as low as 5 frets below a standard guitar, and some as 3 frets low. I do have one baritone guitar handy right now that I can get within about 10 seconds, so I'll go ahead and grab it and bring it over. This is an 18-inch wide guitar made by Grimes in Hawaii. And double sound hole is a feature he does on some of his guitars. They're popular. His instruments are highly regarded by many of the Hawaiian folks, particularly doing slack key open tunings. But this is designed as a baritone guitar. It's beautifully figured Hawaiian koa wood, mahogany neck, spruce top, excellent handcrafted instrument. And this is the Beamer model, named after one of the Hawaiian artists, and available for less than he would charge for a new one, it's $4,750, but he would charge more to build you one like this. But it is a baritone, and he does make Beamer models in standard size. This one actually works pretty well in standard tuning or as a baritone, but the scale is slightly long, and it's a heck of a good sounding guitar, actually. But there are multiple makers who have done baritone guitars. Other question? And I'd be delighted to get some more questions if anybody wishes to submit them today. We did not get as many questions as usual. On the other hand, I'm not noted for being at a loss for words generally. So I'll have no trouble filling an hour of conversation with or without more questions. But Jeffrey submitted a question. Have you ever had a luthier one-hit wonder come into your store? By experience, did you ever hear of the person again? Well, I have seen a fair number of times when somebody came in with a very nice guitar that they had made, and that I was impressed, and I'd never heard of them. But you have to figure that I don't see everybody everywhere, and it's a big world out there. There are guitar makers on virtually every continent except Antarctica. And if they were down there in Antarctica, they'd have a tough time making guitars because it's only a few research stations there. There's no permanent dwellings for people who stay there full time for their life. And born and raised in Antarctica, that don't happen. Um, but every other continent, there's builders. And the other problem with Antarctica is, aside from the fact that you have to import the wood, there's no trees there. The humidity in Antarctica, especially at the South Pole Research Station, is virtually zero because the temperature is always below 0 Fahrenheit. And there's no moisture in the air. And if you bring that inside and heat it to room temperature, it is way, way drier than the middle of the Sahara. And it's almost impossible to humidify that enough to build guitars. It's not good for your health either. It's not a great place to live full time. But one-hit wonders, so far as their very first guitar being phenomenal, like beating any Martin I ever played, no. It takes a while to get good at building guitars. Even if you're a quite skilled woodworker, there's a whole lot of knowledge that goes into building a guitar that works. Getting the neck angles right, the right ratio of mass of bracing to top. You know, even if you copy a Martin or a Gibson or a Fender or whatever, it's going to be really, really hard to get every nuance right so it really feels and plays right your first time around. Guitar builders who build good instruments have typically made at least a dozen instruments. In fact, I do have a piece of advice for folks learning, and that is you can go out and you can buy beautiful wood, the highest possible grade of curly mahogany or curly maple or koa. You can buy magnificent wood, and it's expensive. Or you can buy plain grained wood that is way less money and still structurally good. And for learning, that's what you should use. For all practical purposes, it's a waste of good wood to use the finest wood you can possibly find for your first guitar, or even for your second, third, fourth, or fifth guitar. Because number one of what makes a great guitar is design. And in order to have a great design, you can copy a great design, but you still have to learn its nuances, and you're not likely to get that on your first try. But number one is design. Number two is structural workmanship. And again, this learning curve. Usually there are glitches in what you're doing, and you just find it takes you a while to learn how to do a good dovetail joint or a good mortise and tenon joint. It is so much to learn. You're not likely to get that on your first time around. It's just like on painting. You know, an artist like Picasso didn't learn such that his very first painting ever was a masterpiece. He did have a lot of formal training. He went beyond his formal training. He got very innovative, but he had a classical background. He had training. And there's really a lot more that goes into building a guitar than a painting. A painting, you put paint on canvas. You don't have to worry about its structural integrity. If you use good quality paint and you're on a canvas or a piece of wood or whatever medium you're painting on, if it's stable, you don't have to have near the skill to at least have it hold up as to build a guitar. A guitar has different species of wood. It has many, many structural components. They have to go together properly. That you have to know how they're really working to understand it. Because the feel of a guitar can be tremendously different depending on minute changes in neck angle, in the shape of your saddle and nut on the bridge, the mass of the bridge, so many factors, literally hundreds of factors that go into that, more than on a painting. It's not to say that there isn't skill in a painting, but the point is you don't see painters who painted one that's equivalent to the Mona Lisa and they never painted anything else in their life. That doesn't happen. In order to get that degree of skill, you spend years perfecting it. Some people perfect it quicker than others. Some have more innate talent than others. But even the ones with great innate talent, their very first one is not likely to be a masterpiece. And it's certainly true for guitars. So generally, I'm surprised when I meet somebody who's really, really good that I never heard of, but I'm not as surprised as I used to be. It used to be back in the 70s, I thought I could pretty well count the really good individual handcraft luthiers on the fingers of one hand. And today, I don't have enough digits, fingers, toes, etc. I don't have as many digits as there are good makers. The Guild of American Luthiers and the Association of Stringed Instrument Artisans have well over 3,000 members each. And even if only 5% of them were good, that's way more than I got fingers and toes. And there are guys who have built only a very few instruments who are surprisingly good. I remember Lynn Dudenbostel, who is in Maryville, Tennessee. The first one of his I saw, he hadn't built but half a dozen, but he had worked as a pattern maker for Martin Marietta Company, doing patterns in wood they would then later do for the metal. And those things had to be done with great precision. And he had knowledge of instruments and extraordinary working skills with wood. It didn't take him long to get good, but it still was such, his very first one was nowhere near as good as what he makes right now. There is a learning curve. So this bit of one-hit wonders, not much, but there are some that I think haven't been very effective at marketing themselves. And I have seen a few mandolin builders who I think build really good instruments, but they don't seem to know how to market them. And they're not household names, which I think they ought to be, but they aren't. And in some cases, I just work to get them to consign instruments to me if I think they have merit. And one I'll say has great merit, I'm impressed with, Paul Newsom in Michigan, builds some really great mandolins. And I could show you one real quick, but he's not as well known as I think he ought to be. And I think his instruments will go down to be highly collectible in the future, but they're pretty darn good right now. And I'm highly impressed with it, but he's also been doing it for 30 some years. So it's not like his very first one was the one-hit wonder. But I'll bring one of his. And this is a mandolin by Paul Newsom. And it is different from a Gibson F5, although the body shape is basically copied directly from an F5. The peg head shape is copied from it. His graduation pattern on the body for the back and top graduations are very similar, but not identical. And he also can toy around with it such that if you tell him you want a bassy, woofy sound or a more classical sound, he can tailor that. And he can give you a very balanced with strong trebles, or he can give you one with deeper bass. And he's able to do that pretty predictably well. And this is a beautifully crafted handmade instrument, $8,500. Which is way less than buying an old F5 pre-war Gibson. Dan Tominski has one of these, which he says is the best sounding mandolin that he has ever owned. So they're good, but is he a one-hit wonder that just built one the first time around? It was fabulous and then disappears? No. So generally people who build really, really great instruments have built a goodly number to get there, and they don't give up easily. They keep at it. Even if they seem not to be very great on marketing, they're still likely to be doing some instruments 30 years later, because it somehow gets into their psyche and they never quite give up on it. Mark Gallagher says he just bought a Taylor 814 CE with a Picate wood back and sides, apparently bought from here. Why did Taylor use that wood? And is it expected that the sound range will deepen, get more resonant as it's played? This wood is from Central America. It is a species, it's in a family of shrubs and trees, of which there's over 300 different species in that general family, found in the West Indies, in Mexico, and basically covering a pretty wide range: West Indies, Mexico, Central America. Taylor's experimenting with many different kinds of wood. I guess maybe rather than saying experimenting, it's they're using it with good success, including what they're calling urban forest wood. When trees are cut down in urban development or after a storm, sometimes there's a bunch of trees in an urban setting that are laying on the ground, and it's good wood. A lot of lumber yards won't use it because occasionally they're worried that there could be a nail or something in it. If it grew in a forest or on a tree farm, where you can be absolutely sure that there's not any metal in that tree, no nails or anything of that sort that would mess up their saws, they're happier. With urban wood, there's always this possibility that somebody had nailed something on it or whatever. But in general, Taylor has found good success using some of this wood and promoting it as being environmentally friendly, and using a variety of different species with good success. Is it better than fine mahogany or rosewood? I think not. But first and foremost is design. If you have great design and good structural workmanship, and you understand enough about the properties of wood, you can figure out for each species that some need to be a little thicker, some a little thinner. You can figure out the right ratios, and you can make some remarkably good sounding guitars out of a wide variety of different types of wood. Brian Gallup in Michigan has a computer program that he is offering to makers, which can analyze wood and figure out its tensile strength, its density, its acoustic properties. And he can tell a luthier exactly how thick he recommends for each component part of each different type of wood and how well they match up together. And I have played a number of his instruments that utilize his technology, and they are good. On the other hand, he's a very good builder. So his instruments start at around $20,000 and go up. I've heard instruments he's made with Brazilian rosewood. I've heard instruments he's made with paulownia wood, in which the tree grows fast enough that in 10 years it's harvestable for building full-size guitars. So there's quite a range there. So what I can say is that Taylor and others are utilizing a wide variety, and Taylor especially is very involved with that. Bob Taylor is deep into sustainable harvest wood. And at this point, Andy Powers is doing much of the design work for Taylor, and Bob is devoting virtually full time to wood, gathering wood, promoting sustainable use, and tree farming, etc. So Taylor is a leader in that area. Ken asks, can you convey your thoughts on the removal of a Virzi tone producer from a lower period F5? Perhaps you could speak to its effect on value and its effect on sonically on the instrument. This is a much debated topic in the mandolin world, as you are well aware, I am sure. Well, many of the F5 mandolins, in fact, the majority of them made in the year 1924, which is a year in which Lohr signed labels, have a Virzi tone producer, which is a disc with two little sound holes in it, suspended from the top braces. And many bluegrassers call them a Virzi tone reducer. Well, they actually sound quite good for classical style. There were only about 250 F5 Lohr models made. And to change one, I think, is not a good idea. The sound you will get afterward is not necessarily predictably better. I have 3 Lohr F5s right now that have Virzis in them, and they sound quite good. They don't have the classic Monroe type sound, but I don't think that it's a smart idea to irrevocably change instruments that are that rare. That's more rare than a Stradivari violin. Stradivari made over 1,100 instruments in his lifetime. There are at least 650 well-documented surviving Stradivari violins in existence today. And that's a lot more than there are Lohr F5s ever made, which there are only about 250 ever made, and they're not all intact now. So every time you change one, that's one less that's original for the next generation to ever observe or hear. And my experience is that for classical style mandolin and for jazz, the ones with the Virzi sound great. And Monroe style bluegrass is not the only sound out there. And if you want one of those, you know, you can probably come closer to the sound you want by getting something like a Gilchrist or a Newson anyway. But I do not recommend changing it. And so far as those who say that they like the sound better without the Virzi, they should just get something without a Virzi that isn't a Lohr to do it with. I feel that instruments like that are so rare are almost like a living organism, like a child. And I pretty much equate taking a Virzi out of an original Lohr F5 on par with tattooing minor age children. I don't advise it, and I find it revolting. And so I'm beyond not recommending it. I will not sell one to somebody who's going to do that. Bill Clark says, Christian Martin IV retired as CEO of Martin a couple of years back. Is the Martin company still being run by a Martin family member? What changes at Martin do you see with CF IV retiring? Well, he really didn't retire a couple of years ago. He did that very recently. He announced that he would retire, but his new CEO, Thomas Ripsum, is German, has played guitar since his youth, is knowledgeable and is just very recently started. I will be meeting him next month at the NAMM show in Nashville. I'm hearing good things about him, but he is not a member of the Martin family. I think it's very unclear if Chris's daughter Claire, who is now 16, will ever have interest in running the company. I'm not going to try to speculate on that, but I will say is that I think that Martin is in good hands with the new CEO, and I'll have more to say about it after I've met him. But the people who have met him at Martin and have spoken with him say that his choice was a result of a very careful, extended search, and that they are satisfied that they found one of the best people possible anywhere in the world for this job. He not only plays guitar, he took a sabbatical in 2019 for a year to study guitar building. So he knows how to build a guitar, he knows how to play a guitar, he has a background in business management and finance and employee relations. He seems to have an ideal set of skills. I have high expectations that he's going to do a fine job, but we will soon see. John from Wilmington, North Carolina, can you talk a little bit about old growth wood and the importance of it in guitar building? First, define old growth wood. When were Martin guitars being built with old growth wood? For example, was the Brazilian rosewood used by Martin to build D28s in the 1940s and 1950s old growth wood? From what I understand, the Sinker mahogany guitars you are selling, Sinkers are made from old growth wood. Are other guitars being built today using old growth wood? Well, any wood that you see in spruce or cedar or Engelmann, any species of top wood, if you see 25 or more grain lines to the inch, then you know that it took 25 years of growth for that 1 inch to accumulate. So you can figure out that if you have a guitar that is 16 inches wide and it's got a 2-piece top, and that top is 2-piece book matched, so it took 8 divided by, well, 25 years for 1 inch. So it took 100 years to grow 4 inches. So you have to have a tree there that's a minimum of 200 years old to get to 8 inches. And you need a tree that's actually bigger than that because it's heartwood and sapwood, and you need a tree that is good grain quality throughout. So you can't have a tree that is just 8 inches in diameter. To do this, it's got to be, it would have to be a 16-inch diameter tree really to get good wedges of that sort. And it really needs to be bigger than that. The point is, it's got to be pretty old growth wood. You don't have tree farm wood for tops. It's much good. It's going to have all the grain lines you want. Now, some of the hardwoods grow quicker, and Indian rosewood can be grown in a farm situation. Brazilian rosewood is not grown on tree farms. So if it's big enough, it may be secondary growth, but it's not all of it is in a total virgin forest. But the Sinker mahogany that is in guitars that I am selling is wood that was cut between 100 to 150 years ago. And it is wood in areas that had not been cut previously. That's old growth wood. And typically those old growth forests are very dense. There's the lighting for the younger trees is dim. They're struggling to get up to the canopy. So they grow slow, the wood is denser, and that's great stuff. The secondary growth, if land has been cleared and trees grew after that, and they're spaced out more, they tend to grow quicker, and it's often not as good for guitars. But I have played guitars made with Polonia, such as one that Brian Gallup did, where the tree is ready in 10 years and surprisingly good. But top wood, if you're seeing spruce or cedar, any top wood that you can count the grain lines, you'll find that those trees were old. And they're definitely not tree farm. The Sitka spruce that you see, that's old growth wood. It's dense forests, and when they're cut, some of those trees may have been 600 years or more old, and that's not easily replaced. And there are problems environmentally when you clear cut that stuff, that you get a good yield right now, but what's going to happen later? If it took 600 years to grow it, you're not going to find a tree farm that's going to help us anytime soon. Interestingly enough, I was reading just a newspaper today about how some of the Native American reservation areas are now being heavily involved with petroleum production. And that's also something environmentally unfriendly. So it's a mistake to think that Native Americans always use the environment better. A lot of the Sitka spruce today is from Native American controlled areas. And some of those folks think short term, and tree farming is not what they're about. Sustainable yield harvesting is not necessarily what they're all about. But that's a different issue. But anyway, there's still a goodly bit of old growth wood around. Problem is, a lot of that forest area that's old growth is being cut way faster than is anywhere remotely near sustainable. Indonesia's rate of cutting and Madagascar's rate of cutting is such that I have fears that within 15 years, there won't be any old growth wood left. And there'll be remarkably little rainforest left worldwide. So this is highly problematic. Let's see. John Meltzer, which of the small batch US guitar makers do you recommend for OM, parlor, and dreadnought size instruments? Well, frankly, I think it's hard to narrow that down. I mean, there are certainly numerous builders who do, one-man operation, and they do great guitars. But there's also companies that do great guitars, and in many cases, I think that there's this idea that because it was built by an individual luthier, that automatically it's better than anything from a factory. You have to figure that those classic era Martins, Gibsons, and Fender Electrics, those are factory guitars. And even Martin, when they were making those guitars I showed earlier today, over 100 years ago, it was a small operation. Martin, in CF Senior's days, was a little company. It was a workshop rather than what anything today would be called a factory. But they're great. The new Martins today, in my opinion, are better sounding and better playing and structurally more stable than many instruments from individual handcraft luthiers. And that's one reason why we sell so many of them and promote them so strongly. There are plenty of good builders. And I'm not going to try to get it down to one particular or two or three, but there are good small shops that do boutique guitars. Very little of it, in my opinion, is truly superior to what can be had from Martin out of their custom shop. But certainly Santa Cruz is a small shop. It's not a one-man operation. They do beautiful guitars. Dana Bourgeois does nice guitars. Collings is more, it's smaller than Martin, but Collings has a factory. They got lots of CNC equipment. Collings is not necessarily more handmade than a Martin. Their workmanship is meticulous. Taylor is a big factory and lots of CNC equipment, but their work is very neat and clean. It's going to be a matter of personal preference, but when it comes right down to it, where do I put my money on new guitars? It's primarily with factory-made guitars, Martin, Taylor, Fender for electrics, some Collings instruments, some Larrivee instruments. And am I doing boutique instruments from small individual luthiers? The answer to that basically is, with the exception of Paul Newsom's mandolins, not much. But that's partly also because a lot of the boutique builders don't sell wholesale to dealers. They sell direct. And while they may make a good instrument, it's not a profitable instrument for a dealer. If they don't offer a wholesale price to dealers, then we don't have those. But at any rate, that's what I can say. I'm not going to recommend individual small batch makers, other than to say that there are a number of very good ones. But I still would urge that you carefully place before buying next to what's available, such as the custom shop Martins, to see if they really are better. And, you might be surprised. James Folker asked, could you show the 12-fret, 12-string guitar hanging over your left shoulder? Yep, I could do that. This is a Martin Sinker mahogany, 12-string, 12-fret, quadruple O size, non-torrefied Adirondack, nicely figured Sinker mahogany, neck back sides, style 45 neck trim with the style 45 torch, snowflake inlays, herringbone trim on the body with the zigzag back stripes. So essentially, style 28 body trim, style 45 neck trim, grain divroid bindings, a very deluxe 12-string, similar in size to Leadbelly's guitar, has an adjustable neck rod, and these are some of the absolute finest 12-string guitars ever made, because it's similar in size to the old Stella, but it's not similar in construction. This is a way, way better made guitar. And I'm a bit prejudiced since I designed it, but I think that these are the best 12-string guitars that I've ever played. We have only a couple of those right now. With that level of ornamentation, we do have more on order coming in with the style 18 ornamentation and sinker. We did have a batch of those previous, and they're all sold, and they went to good players, including Vince Gill got one. He said he typically doesn't like 12 strings, but that was good enough. He had to have one. So it is something that we view as being quite special. Tom Littlefield asks, can you elaborate on why the L5 is your favorite guitar? Again, the L5 models with the 16-inch body are among my favorite guitars, but are they going to be better for everybody? The answer is no. It's, as archtops go, it's a remarkably versatile instrument. You can finger pick it, you can flat pick it, you can play country music, you can play jazz. It's not a classical guitar. Maybelle Carter played one, and it's a great guitar for me. My Lore signed L5 has a really big fat neck, but the 1929 model I have that's similar to Maybelle's has a neck that's remarkably similar to a 1959 Les Paul contour, a very modern feeling neck. But they are a different sound than a flat top, and they suit what I do extremely well. Would it be the ideal backup bluegrass guitar? No. Is it going to suit the majority of my customers? No. Do I enjoy Martins? Yes. I like lots of guitars. There's more than one type of guitar. The L5 is one of my personal favorites. And if I had to pick one personal favorite of my collection, it is my Lore signed L5. But do I think that that's what the majority of my customers would find to be the best? The answer is no. There's so many different kinds of music, so many different styles of playing. It's hard to even define what is a guitar. But an archtop F-hole guitar is structurally a very different beast from a flat top. The way it functions is quite different. The way it sounds is different, even though it's tuned the same as a standard flat top guitar. And guitars are so different from each other, it's hard to even define what is a guitar. There's not even one standard tuning. There's lots of different tunings for a guitar, so many different designs. I'm not going to get into it other than to say that I love the L5s of the 1920s, particularly the Lore signed ones, but any of them from the 20s, the 16-inch L5s are fabulous. But there's lots and lots of guitars, enough that means that there'll be more we could talk about next week. And we're not going to run out of topics to talk about because guitars are very diverse. The music is diverse. The players are diverse. The audience is diverse. And it's affected by demographic trends, technological trends, economic trends, social trends, the ecology of what is available in the world today and would, and what will be in the future. Numerous topics to discuss. What I would like is for those of you who have questions about any of these type topics, email those questions to us. And next week, I'll be happy to get to another session and address whatever questions are sent in. Till then, have a good one.